My wife disappeared while I was at work. When I got home, half the house was empty. On the kitchen counter, she left a note. It said 3 things. Let it go. Please don't make this worst. This is the best way for both of us. At the time, I thought our marriage was ended. Then, federal agents knocked on the door. My name is Daniel. A few years ago, I read a text message that wasn't meant for me. It only took 5 words to change the way I saw my entire life. But to understand why that message mattered so much, you need to know what my life looked like before I read it. On the surface, everything seemed stable. My wife, Claire, and I had been married for 7 years. We had a small house in a quiet neighborhood where the streets looked the same in every direction. Rows of trimmed lawns, mailboxes that leaned slightly, and porch lights that came on automatically at sunset. The kind of place where nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. I worked as a project manager for a construction company. The job was predictable. Long hours, steady paycheck. The kind of work where every problem had a solution if you were willing to stay late enough to find it. Claire worked in marketing for a local tech company. Her schedule was different from mine. Later mornings, occasional travel, client dinners. We had routines. Friday takeout. Sunday grocery shopping. The quiet rhythm of 2 people who had built a life together piece by piece. And for a long time, I believed those routines meant security. Looking back now, I realize they mostly meant comfort. There's a difference. The night everything shifted was a Wednesday. Nothing special about it. No arguments, no tension in the air. Just an ordinary evening. Claire was in the kitchen finishing a phone call with a coworker while I sat on the couch answering emails on my laptop. The television played softly in the background, one of those crime shows where the same scene seems to repeat every 10 minutes. At some point, Claire walked into the living room and set her phone on the coffee table. Then she went upstairs to take a shower. I remember the exact moment the phone buzzed. It wasn't loud, just a soft vibration against the glass table. I didn't intend to look at it, but the screen lit up. And when a screen lights up in a quiet room, your eyes naturally move toward it. That's all it was at first. Just a glance. But the message preview was visible, and it was from a contact saved simply as Mark. The message said, "Does he suspect anything yet?" 12 words. Or technically 5. But they were enough. For a few seconds, I stared at the phone without touching it. My brain tried to supply harmless explanations. Maybe it was about work. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe I misunderstood. But the longer I looked at those words, the more the room seemed to shrink around me. Because there's something about a message like that. It's not just the question. It's the assumption behind the question. Someone asking whether I suspected something meant there was something to suspect. I picked up the phone. I wish I could say I hesitated longer than I did. But curiosity moves faster than dignity sometimes. When I opened the message thread, the conversation wasn't long. Just a handful of texts from earlier that evening. One of them said, "Dinner was fun today." Another, "We have to be careful." Then the last message, the one asking if I suspected anything yet. I remember setting the phone back down exactly where it had been. Not because I was calm, but because I suddenly felt like a stranger in my own house. Upstairs, I could hear the shower running, water hitting tile, the ordinary sound of a normal night. And for the first time in years, I realized how little I actually understood about the person I had built my life around. Claire came downstairs 15 minutes later with wet hair and comfortable clothes. She sat beside me on the couch and asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I looked at her face and tried to find some visible difference. A sign. Something that would confirm what I had just read. But she looked exactly the same as she always had. Calm. Familiar. Normal. And that might have been the most unsettling part of all. Because when something breaks in your life, you expect the world to look different afterward. But most of the time, it doesn't. The television kept playing. The house stayed quiet. The streetlights outside turned on like they always did. Everything looked exactly the same. Except now I knew there was a conversation happening somewhere in the world about me that I wasn't meant to see. And once you know that kind of thing, you can't unknow it. That night, lying awake beside her, I realized something uncomfortable. The message hadn't just revealed a secret. It had revealed how easily a life can look stable from the outside while something completely different is happening just beneath the surface. People think betrayal feels loud, dramatic, explosive, but sometimes it's just a quiet vibration on a glass coffee table, and 5 words that change everything. But to understand why that message mattered so much, you need to know what my life looked like before I read it. Claire and I met in a way that felt almost too ordinary to remember at the time. It was at a mutual friend's birthday party about 9 years earlier. One of those small gatherings where half the people don't really know each other, and everyone ends up standing in loose circles pretending they're more comfortable than they actually are. I almost didn't go that night. I had worked late and was tired, the kind of tired where you convince yourself that staying home is the responsible choice. But my friend kept texting me, so I showed up. Claire was standing near the kitchen counter talking to 2 people about a movie I'd never seen. I remember noticing that she seemed completely relaxed in a room full of strangers, which was something I had never been particularly good at. At some point, our mutual friend introduced us. The conversation started the way most first conversations do, awkwardly. Small talk about work, where we grew up, the usual questions people ask when they're trying to figure out whether they have anything in common. But the awkwardness didn't last very long. Claire had a way of asking questions that made you feel like she was genuinely interested in the answers. Not the polite kind of interest people fake during conversations, but real curiosity. We ended up talking for almost 2 hours that night, about everything from travel to the strange jobs we had both worked in our early 20s. By the time the party started winding down, the room had emptied out and someone had turned off half the lights. I remember walking to my car feeling unusually certain about something. Not that we were going to get married someday, just that I wanted to see her again. And I did. Dinner the next week turned into another dinner after that. Then weekend plans. Then the quiet understanding that we were building something together. Looking back now, the early years felt simple. We were both figuring out careers, moving between small apartments, learning the rhythms of each other's lives. Claire was ambitious, focused in a way I admired. She always had plans for where she wanted to be 5 years down the road. I was more steady than ambitious. The kind of person who believes if you work hard and treat people well, things usually work themselves out. Somewhere along the way, those 2 approaches fit together. At least, that's what I believed for a long time. Because when you build a life with someone slowly, year after year, it becomes easy to assume the foundation underneath it is solid. You stop checking. You stop wondering. You stop imagining that something small, like a single message on a phone screen, could reveal that the ground beneath you isn't quite what you thought it was. And once you know that kind of thing, you can't unknow it. That night, I didn't sleep. Claire drifted off beside me sometime after midnight, breathing slow and steady like nothing in the world had changed. But my mind kept circling the same question. Who was Mark? The name itself didn't help much. It was common enough to belong to almost anyone. At first, I tried convincing myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a coworker. Maybe the conversation was about someone else entirely. Maybe the message meant something different than what it sounded like. But the words kept replaying in my head. Does he suspect anything yet? There was only one he in that sentence. And it was me. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. Claire was still asleep when I slipped out of bed and went downstairs. Her phone was on the kitchen counter charging. For a few minutes, I just stood there looking at it. I didn't like what I was about to do. But curiosity had already taken hold, and once that happens, it's almost impossible to pretend you're not interested in the answers. I opened the message thread again. This time I read it more carefully. The conversation stretched back about 3 weeks. Not constant messages, just short exchanges scattered every few days. Enough to suggest familiarity, but not enough to tell the whole story. There were references to meeting for coffee. A joke about almost getting caught leaving a restaurant. One message from Claire that said, "We should probably stop texting during the day." And Mark had replied, "Relax. He's not paying attention." I remember sitting down at the kitchen table after reading that one, because it wasn't just the message itself. It was the confidence behind it. Whoever Mark was, he believed he understood my life well enough to know when I was, or wasn't, watching. I kept scrolling. Eventually I found something useful. Mark had sent a link to an article about a local business conference happening downtown. That gave me a starting point. I copied the name from the article and searched the event online. It turned out to be a networking conference for marketing professionals. Claire's Field. The website listed speakers, companies, sponsors. And one of the sponsor companies had a familiar name. The same company mentioned in a few of Mark's messages. I clicked on their staff directory. There were maybe 20 employees listed, but only one Mark. Mark Ellison, mid-30s, business development manager. There was even a small headshot beside his name, one of those professional photos people take against a plain gray background. He looked ordinary, friendly even, the kind of person you wouldn't think twice about if you passed him in a grocery store. I sat there staring at that photo longer than I expected, because up until that moment, Mark had been an abstract idea, a name on a phone screen. Now he was a real person, someone who existed somewhere in the same city as me, someone who had shared dinners and jokes with my wife while I was sitting at home answering work emails. Over the next few days, I kept digging. Not obsessively, at least that's what I told myself. Just enough to understand what I was dealing with. LinkedIn confirmed he worked in the same professional circles as Claire. Instagram showed pictures from conferences, company events, restaurants downtown. And eventually, one photo caught my attention. It was from a group dinner at a marketing event. 5 or 6 people around a table. And sitting 2 chairs away from Mark was Claire. The picture had been posted 2 weeks earlier. They weren't sitting close. Nothing about the image screamed scandal. But they looked comfortable, like 2 people who had spent time around each other before. I remember closing the laptop after that. Not because I had all the answers, but because I suddenly realized something important. Investigating Mark wasn't really about him. It was about trying to understand how long my life had been quietly changing without me noticing. And the more I searched, the clearer one thing became. Whatever was happening between Claire and Mark, it hadn't started with that text message. It had started long before I ever saw the phone light up on the coffee table. For a while, I tried convincing myself that the messages with Mark didn't mean anything. Work friendships happen. Networking leads to inside jokes. Professional relationships can look closer than they actually are. That was the version of the story I repeated to myself. The problem was, little things kept happening that didn't quite fit that explanation. Small things. The kind of details that are easy to dismiss at first. One night, Claire came home later than usual. She said she had been at a client dinner across town. The explanation sounded reasonable. Calm. Casual. But when she set her phone on the kitchen counter, the screen lit up. Just for a second. I wasn't trying to look. But it's amazing how quickly your eyes move when your brain is already suspicious. The message was short. 2 words. Transfer confirmed. No name attached. Just the words. Claire noticed me glancing toward the phone and immediately turned the screen face down. It was such a small movement that most people wouldn't have thought twice about it. But I did, because Claire had never been protective of her phone before. Not once in all the years we'd been together. After that, I started noticing other things. She began attending more networking events than usual. At first, I assumed it was just part of her career picking up momentum. But the pattern became hard to ignore. More evening mixers. More quick drinks with colleagues. More nights where she came home late and seemed oddly distracted. One Saturday morning I logged into our joint banking account to pay a bill. That's when I noticed something else. A deposit. It wasn't huge. A few $1,000s. But the description attached to it didn't make much sense. Consulting reimbursement. Claire had never done consulting work before. At least not that I knew of. When I asked her about it later that evening, she answered quickly. Too quickly. Oh, that's just a small project someone asked me to help with, she said. The explanation sounded simple enough. But something about the way she said it felt rehearsed. Like the answer had been prepared in advance. And then there was the phone. Claire started carrying it everywhere. Into the kitchen. Into the bathroom. Even when she stepped outside to take the trash out. That wasn't the Claire I knew. Before, her phone would sit on the counter for hours without her thinking about it. Now it was always within reach. Always face down. Always locked. I didn't confront her about any of it. At least not directly. Instead, I tried something else. For years I had been the practical one. The husband who worked long hours and usually preferred quiet evenings over crowded professional gatherings. So when I started saying things like, maybe I'll come with you to that one, she smiled. She said it was nice that I wanted to be more involved. And in a way, that part was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The first event I attended with her was a Thursday evening mixer at a hotel downtown. The room was filled with the familiar sounds of professional networking. Soft music, clinking glasses, people introducing themselves with slightly rehearsed enthusiasm. Claire moved easily through the crowd. She always had. Watching her work a room was like watching someone speak a second language fluently. Conversations started and ended naturally. She remembered names, asked smart questions, laughed at the right moments. I stayed close, smiling politely, shaking hands when someone was introduced. But my real attention was somewhere else. Scanning the room. Looking for Mark. It took about 20 minutes before I spotted him. He was standing near a tall cocktail table across the room, talking to two other people. He looked almost exactly like his headshot. Average height. Clean cut. The kind of person who blended easily into professional crowds. For a moment, I just watched. Eventually, Claire saw him too. I noticed it in the small way her posture shifted. Just slightly straighter, just slightly more alert. Not dramatic enough for anyone else to notice. But once you're looking for something, the smallest signals become obvious. She hesitated for half a second before walking in his direction, and I walked with her. Claire introduced us the way people introduce acquaintances. Mark, this is my husband Daniel. Mark smiled, shook my hand, and said it was nice to meet me. His expression never changed. If he was surprised to see me there, he didn't show it. I started showing up more. At networking events. At restaurants where she said she might be meeting colleagues. Sometimes I would text her during the day and say something simple. I'm nearby. Want to grab lunch? And then I would show up at her office. At first she seemed genuinely happy about it. She said it was nice that I wanted to spend more time together. But every once in a while I would catch something in her expression. A brief flicker of surprise. Or maybe disappointment. Like my presence had interrupted something. And the strangest part was what happened whenever Mark was around. Their conversations became shorter. More careful. More formal. Almost like two people suddenly aware they were being watched. But even with all of that, nothing actually stopped. The late messages continued. The networking events kept happening. And the strange deposits now in Claire's account slowly started adding up. That was the moment I realized something important. If something was happening between Claire and Mark, it wasn't going to reveal itself on its own. And whatever the truth was, I wasn't going to find it by guessing. That's when I decided to call the investigator. A week later, during a lunch break at work, I called a private investigator. It felt strange even saying the words out loud. Until that moment, hiring someone to investigate my own wife sounded like something that happened in movies or messy divorces you read about online. Not in ordinary lives like mine. But the investigator I spoke with didn't sound surprised. In fact, he sounded calm in the way people do when they've heard the same story many times before. He explained the process in simple terms. Background checks, financial records, travel history, public activity, and if necessary, discreet observation. When he asked what exactly I wanted to know, I paused for a moment, because the honest answer was simple. Everything. I wanted to know who Mark really was. I wanted to know how long Claire had known him. I wanted to know whether the messages I had seen were the beginning of something, or just the small, visible part of something much bigger. The investigator said it would take a couple of weeks. Maybe a little longer if financial records needed deeper digging. During that time, I went back to living my normal life. At least on the surface. I went to work. Claire and I had dinner together. We talked about ordinary things, the house, weekend plans, the weather. But underneath those everyday moments was a quiet sense of waiting. Like standing in a room where you know someone is about to say something important, but they haven't spoken yet. 2.5 weeks later, the investigator called me. He said he had gathered more information than he expected. There was a pause on the phone before he continued. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. Daniel, he said, what I found doesn't just involve your wife and Mark. Another pause. There are financial connections here too. In that moment, I realized the situation I thought I understood. The messages, the meetings, the quiet glances across crowded rooms might only be the surface of something far more complicated. Something that had been unfolding for longer than I realized. And once I saw the full report, none of our lives would look the same again. We met 3 days later. The investigator suggested a quiet coffee shop on the edge of downtown. One of those places where people sit with laptops for hours and no one pays attention to anyone else's conversations. When I arrived, he was already there. A man in his late 50s, gray hair, pressed shirt, a leather folder sitting neatly on the table beside his coffee. He didn't waste much time with small talk. After a brief handshake, he slid the folder toward me. "I want you to understand something before you read this," he said. "What I found goes back further than you probably expect." That sentence alone was enough to make my chest tighten. I opened the folder. Inside were printed pages, timelines, screenshots, and financial summaries. The kind of organized report that only exists when someone has spent a lot of time digging through records. The first page contained something I hadn't anticipated: a timeline. At the top were two names: Claire Bennett, Mark Ellison, and below that were dates stretching back several years. I looked up. "I thought they met recently," I said. The investigator shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "They've known each other a lot longer than that." He explained that Claire and Mark had first crossed paths nearly 4 years earlier at a regional marketing conference. At the time, it appeared to be nothing more than a professional connection. Two people working in overlapping industries attending the same events. But after that first meeting, their paths continued crossing. Different conferences, industry panels, networking functions. The investigator tapped one of the pages. "Your wife attended at least 6 events where Mark was also present over the past few years." I stared at the timeline again. Those events lined up with periods when Claire had mentioned work trips or professional seminars. None of it had sounded unusual at the time. The investigator continued. "Based on the communication patterns and financial activity we tracked, their relationship appears to have changed roughly 8 months ago." 8 months. I did the math automatically. That was several months before the text message I had seen. Several months before I even knew Mark's name. "What changed?" I asked. The investigator slid another document toward me. This one wasn't about meetings or travel. It was about money. 2 separate bank accounts had been opened within the past year. One in Mark's name, another in Claire's. Both accounts were connected to a small consulting company registered under a neutral-sounding name, something generic enough that it wouldn't attract attention. But the activity inside those accounts was harder to ignore. Deposits from companies that regularly bid on municipal and regional government contracts. Transfers moving through intermediary accounts. Payments that appeared shortly before or after certain contracts were awarded. Nothing labeled openly as illegal, but enough irregularities to raise questions. I looked up slowly. "What exactly does Mark do?" I asked. The investigator leaned back slightly. "Officially? Business development, consulting, strategic partnerships." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Unofficially, it appears he helps companies navigate certain obstacles when competing for public contracts." The phrasing was careful, but the meaning was clear. Influence, introductions, maybe conversations that happened in quiet rooms where favors were exchanged. "And Claire?" I asked. The investigator opened another page in the folder. "She appears to have reconnected with Mark at an industry event about 8 months ago. Shortly after that, the financial activity involving her account begins." The page showed a series of dates. Event attendance, email exchanges, then the first transfer. Not a huge amount, but enough to notice. "From what we can tell," the investigator said, "your wife may have started assisting Mark by facilitating introductions within her professional network. Introductions that could open doors. Doors that led to contracts. Contracts worth millions of dollars. And small percentages moving quietly into consulting accounts." I sat there staring at the pages for a long time, because the story I had been imagining up until that point had been simpler. An affair. A relationship behind my back. Painful, yes, but understandable in a human way. What the investigator was describing was something else entirely. Something structured, organized, possibly criminal. I finally looked up. "So you're saying they're running some kind of operation?" The investigator didn't answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands on the table. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that the financial patterns, the business connections, and the timing of certain government contracts suggest your wife and Mark may be involved in activities that go beyond a personal relationship." Another pause. Then he added quietly, "And if that's the case, this situation could affect more than just your marriage." For a long moment, the noise of the coffee shop seemed very far away, because the problem I thought I was dealing with had just grown much larger. And suddenly, the text message that started all of this felt like the smallest piece of the story. The investigator turned a few more pages in the folder. "This part is about Mark," he said. The page in front of me looked less like a resume and more like a patchwork of overlapping careers. Mark Ellison had worked in business development for several companies over the past 15 years. Nothing unusual at first glance. Mid-level positions, consulting roles, advisory titles. The kind of career that moved between industries but always stayed adjacent to money. But when the investigator began pointing out the details, the pattern changed. Mark tends to appear in places where companies are trying to secure large contracts, he explained. Construction, infrastructure, technology services, anything that involves government bids. Each job seemed to last just long enough for a major deal to close. Then Mark would move on, sometimes to a consulting role, sometimes to a new company that happened to be pursuing contracts in the same region. Officially, he's a connector, the investigator continued. Someone who introduces the right people to each other. He tapped one of the notes on the page. But there are several instances where companies he worked with secured government contracts shortly after he became involved. No formal charges. No public investigations. Just a series of coincidences that repeated themselves often enough to stop looking like coincidences. And that's where Claire comes in, he said. He turned to another section of the report. This timeline began 4 years earlier. Claire and Mark had first met at a regional marketing and business development conference. At the time, Claire was still building her career. Her company had sent her to represent them at a panel discussion about digital strategy. Mark had been there representing a consulting group that specialized in helping businesses compete for public sector contracts. According to the investigator, they spoke briefly during a networking reception after the conference. Nothing unusual. Just two professionals exchanging contact information. For the next few years, their paths crossed occasionally at similar events. Industry mixers, workshops, annual conferences where the same people from the same industries tended to gather. The investigator pointed to several photos pulled from public event pages. In two of them, Claire and Mark appeared in the background of group shots, standing near each other, talking, not close enough to suggest anything personal, just familiar enough that they clearly recognized each other. But then something changed about 8 months ago. At another networking event downtown, Claire and Mark ended up talking for almost an hour. That much was confirmed by multiple social media photos from the event. The investigator slid one of the printouts toward me. Claire and Mark were standing near a high table, leaning slightly toward each other in conversation. Neither of them looked particularly secretive, just engaged. What we found after that event is where things start shifting, the investigator said. He pointed to a note in the timeline. Apparently Claire had mentioned something during that conversation that caught Mark's attention. According to a message recovered from Mark's phone backup, obtained through legal data records, the conversation had turned personal for a moment. Claire had said something about how frustrating her work had become. She had been putting in long hours, managing difficult clients, helping companies grow their businesses. But the financial rewards, the promotions, the real influence in the industry, those seemed to go to other people. People higher up, people who already had connections. She had joked, apparently half seriously, that sometimes it felt like she was helping everyone else make money, just not herself. The investigator looked up from the page. That's when Mark started paying closer attention. After that event, the two of them began communicating more frequently. At first, the messages were casual. Industry gossip, comments about conferences, complaints about long hours and demanding clients. But over time, the tone shifted. Mark started talking about how certain people in their industry made money differently, not just by working harder, but by understanding how decisions were really made behind the scenes. Introductions, timing, influence, small opportunities that only existed for people who knew where to look. The investigator tapped the final page in that section. About 6 weeks after that event, he said, the consulting account was opened. Claire's name appeared on the documents shortly afterward. At first, her involvement seemed small, facilitating introductions between Mark and certain contacts in her professional network, recommending companies that might benefit from Mark's consulting services. But once the first few transactions went through, the activity increased. More introductions, more meetings, more money moving through accounts that didn't exist a year earlier. I stared down at the timeline again, because it was becoming clear that what had looked like a sudden betrayal had actually been building quietly for months, maybe longer. Mark hadn't rushed anything. He had simply waited for the right conversation, the right moment, The moment when Claire admitted she felt like she was working hard without seeing the rewards. And once she said that out loud, he showed her another way to get them. For the next few days after meeting the investigator, I carried the folder everywhere. Not physically, but mentally. Every conversation with Claire suddenly felt different. Every ordinary moment, making dinner, watching television, talking about work, felt like it was happening on top of something fragile and invisible. I kept replaying the investigator's words. Secret accounts, government contracts, introductions that moved money. I had spent years believing I understood the person I married. And now I wasn't sure if I knew her at all. But I still didn't say anything. Partly because I didn't know what to say. And partly because I couldn't quite accept that Claire, the woman I had built a life with, could actually be involved in something like this. So I did nothing, at least on the surface. Then, late one night, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. It was short. You're looking into things that don't concern you. Let it go, or we'll make sure you regret it. No name. No explanation. Just the warning. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time. Because suddenly the situation didn't just feel complicated. It felt dangerous. 2 days later, things escalated. While I was at work, someone knocked on my office door and handed me a legal envelope. Divorce papers. Claire had filed that morning. When I got home that evening, the house felt strangely empty. Her car was gone. Half of the closet was empty. Most of the small things she used every day had disappeared. On the kitchen counter was a single note. 3 short sentences written in her handwriting. Let it go. Please don't make this worse. This is the best way for both of us. That was it. No explanation. No conversation. Just an ending delivered quietly while I was gone. After the warning message, I started noticing things I had never noticed before. A car parked down the street for 2 days straight. A man sitting in the same coffee shop booth every morning. Maybe it meant nothing. But once you start looking for danger, everything looks like it could be it. 3 days later, the investigator called again. His voice sounded different this time. More tense. Daniel, he said, they know we've been looking. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? I asked. I mean, someone reached out to one of my contacts, he replied. Someone connected to the mayor's office. There was a long pause before he continued. They told me something directly. In person. Another pause. Then he said the part that stayed with me. Let it go. He exhaled slowly. Daniel, there are powerful people connected to these deals. A lot of money at stake. The kind of people who don't hesitate to ruin lives if someone gets in the way. He let that sit for a moment. Claire's gone. Don't ruin your life over this. Let it go. My stomach tightened. Those were the exact same words Claire had written in the note she left on the kitchen counter the morning she disappeared. And suddenly one question pushed everything else out of my mind. How did he know Claire was gone? I hadn't told anyone. Not my friends. Not my coworkers. Not even my own family. Which meant only one thing. They were already watching. What the investigator didn't know was that things were already moving. Because the day after receiving the threatening text message, I had called someone I trusted. An old college friend who had become a lawyer. By the time the investigator warned me to let it go, my friend had already helped me contact federal authorities. Over the next week, I turned over everything. The investigator's reports, the financial documents, the screenshots of messages, the threatening text, even recordings of my conversations with the investigator. The evidence went to people who dealt with things much bigger than broken marriages. Federal investigators, and the IRS. After I handed everything over to the federal investigators, I expected to feel relief. I had been carrying the weight of the truth alone, documents, messages, financial records that showed just how deep the situation had become. Now it wasn't just my problem anymore. People with real authority were handling it. At least, that's what I told myself. But relief never really came. Instead, something else settled in. A quiet kind of fear. Not the loud, dramatic kind you see in movies. The kind that shows up in small moments when you're alone with your thoughts. At first it was just a feeling that I was being watched. Driving home from work one evening, I noticed the same dark SUV behind me for several miles. It turned off eventually, but the thought stayed with me long after. Another night I stopped at a grocery store and caught myself scanning the parking lot before walking inside. Looking for faces. Looking for anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination trying to fill in the blanks. But once you realize powerful people might have something to lose, your mind starts connecting dots everywhere. Sleep became difficult. Every sound in the house seemed louder than usual. A car driving slowly down the street. Footsteps on the sidewalk outside. The quiet vibration of my phone on the nightstand. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and check the locks on the doors without really thinking about it, just to make sure. During the day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, answered emails, had the same conversations I always had with coworkers. But underneath it all was the constant awareness that something much bigger than me had been set in motion. An investigation that involved people with money, people with influence, people who were probably starting to realize that someone had exposed them. A few days later, one of the federal agents called to check in. His tone was calm, almost reassuring. But one sentence stayed with me after the call ended. "Daniel," he said, "you did the right thing. Just try to keep your routine normal for now. Try to keep things normal." The truth was, nothing about my life felt normal anymore. Because once you step into something like that, once you become the person who hands over the evidence, you can't help wondering who else now knows your name. A week after I turned everything over to the federal investigators, one of them asked if we could meet again. This time the conversation was shorter, more direct. The agent sat across from me with a thin folder in front of him. He didn't open it. He just rested his hands on top of it while he spoke. "We're moving forward with the investigation," he said. I nodded. "That's good, right?" I asked. "It is," he replied. "But investigations like this tend to make people nervous." He paused before continuing. "Especially the people who have the most to lose." The room felt a little quieter after that. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Daniel, have you noticed anything unusual lately?" I hesitated. The car that seemed to follow me for several blocks. The feeling of being watched in parking lots. The strange late-night message. I told him about all of it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and thought for a moment. "Most of the time," he said carefully, "situations like this don't escalate beyond intimidation." That word stayed with me. Intimidation. "But," he added, "it might be a good idea for you to spend some time somewhere quiet for a while." "Quiet?" I asked. "Somewhere outside the city. Somewhere predictable people wouldn't immediately think to look." He didn't say the word hide, but the meaning was clear enough. That night I called my old college friend, the lawyer who had helped me contact the authorities in the first place. He didn't sound surprised. "Actually," he said, "I might have a place." One of his clients owned a small cabin several hours north of the city, mostly used during hunting season, isolated enough that visitors were rare. "Go there for a few weeks," he suggested. "Let things cool down while the investigation moves forward." The next morning I packed a small bag. Nothing dramatic. A few clothes, my laptop, some documents, just enough to disappear quietly for a while. I left before sunrise. The city was still half asleep when I pulled onto the highway. Streetlights fading in the rearview mirror. The skyline shrinking behind me. At first the drive felt almost peaceful. Early morning roads tend to be empty, and the silence inside the car gave my mind too much space to wander. Every set of headlights in the mirror caught my attention. Every car that stayed behind me for more than a few miles made me wonder if it was coincidence or something else. Once or twice I even changed lanes just to see if the car behind me would do the same. Most of the time they didn't. But that didn't stop the thought from creeping in. About 2 hours into the drive, the highway gave way to smaller roads. Then smaller ones. Trees began to close in on both sides of the pavement, turning the sunlight into thin streaks between branches. By the time I turned onto the gravel road that led to the cabin, the world felt very far away from the city I had left behind. The cabin sat alone near the edge of a clearing. Simple. Quiet. Almost too quiet. I parked the car and sat there for a moment before getting out. For the first time in days, there were no passing cars. No crowds. No unfamiliar faces. Just wind moving through the trees. It should have felt safe. Instead, it felt like stepping into a long pause. The kind that comes before something important finally happens. And as I carried my bag inside, I couldn't shake the strange realization that the life I had been living only a few weeks earlier already felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Quiet woods. Long days of waiting. Occasional phone calls with investigators asking careful questions. Time moves strangely when you're waiting for something big to happen. Weeks passed. Then months. And eventually, the news started appearing. First in small articles, then in larger headlines. A federal investigation into contract bribery and influence peddling connected to multiple municipal projects. Several business figures were named. A few government officials were quietly removed from their positions. And eventually, two names appeared together in the same article. Mark Ellison, Claire Bennett. The investigation uncovered a network of companies paying intermediaries to help secure public contracts. Mark had been acting as a broker. Claire had been helping open doors. Neither of them went to prison, but the consequences were still public and permanent. Heavy fines, probation, professional careers destroyed overnight, and headlines that followed them everywhere. Months later, I received a letter from Claire. Not an email, an actual letter. In it, she apologized. She said she regretted everything. She said things had gotten out of control faster than she ever expected. She insisted that there had never been an affair between her and Mark. She wrote that she had always loved me, and she asked if, someday, maybe we could at least be friends. I read the letter more than once, because the truth was complicated. Part of me still cared about her. Some feelings don't disappear just because the story ends badly. But another part of me remembered the messages I had seen, the way she and Mark talked about me, the quiet calculation behind it all, and the fact that her choices had put my life in danger. Love can survive many things, but not everything. So I never responded. Years have passed since then. I moved to a different city several hours away. A quieter place. A place where most people have never heard of the investigation that once filled the news. Life slowly rebuilt itself. I remarried. We have 2 kids now. And most days are filled with the kind of ordinary happiness I once thought I had lost. I still think about Claire sometimes. Not with anger. Not with regret. Just with the quiet understanding that some people don't ruin your life. They simply show you the truth about it. In the end, I did let it go. Not because she asked me to, but because some things in life aren't worth holding on to. Especially the people who betray you. The past is still there, but it stays where it belongs. Behind me. Thank you for listening until the end. Please join the Biohazard Zone, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let's grow this channel together.